Caretos. This is a Portuguese game inspired by Portuguese lore. The subject matter is one that I did not know before I learned about its existence from the game, so I did some research, and it looks like the Caretos are a tradition in which the youth of the village dress like the monsters that you see here, and for a period of time they go around the village doing pranks of various kinds. In this game, however, the Caretos are real. They are real monsters, well, I guess, but there are certainly some monsters, which is you, the players. The Caretos are monsters, but they're not controlled by players. They are your distinct competition. Each player controls a team of 2 monsters. You go around the board trying to scare the villagers to break up groups so that they run away in terror, and then when you catch them alone, you capture them. Your job in the game is to score points by capturing lone villagers and also by performing other kinds of tasks. Here you see the board of the game. It is double-sided. You will determine which side you use based on the number of players. Simply, the more players means more locations. It is a point-to-point map, so some points, that is, some locations are generic and some represent specific locations that do have game effects. At the beginning of the game, you will place meeples on the board. Meeples of different colors represent different types of villagers, and they may be targeted by different kinds of effects. Also, where there is a group of villagers at the beginning of the game, you also place a campfire token. We'll see what that means. You have 2 Careto tokens on the board, and they will be controlled by different players. And then you have other tokens representing different types of unique monsters. I really like these transparent tokens, well, with a transparent background, and the monster not transparent, otherwise was this the Invisible Man. Really, really cool monsters. So each monster has a token that goes on the board to mark the location, and then also a card with different types of powers. In particular, each monster has 3 actions, each marked by a different symbol, and then the players will play cards to activate those actions. The general idea is that Caretos can be controlled by any player as long as you have the right symbols. Otherwise, during your turn, you will usually activate one of your 2 monsters. So each player receives 2 random monsters at the beginning of the game. A lot of variety here because these monsters are really different from one another, vastly different actions and gameplay. So a lot of variety there because playing with different combinations of monsters does change things quite a bit. So the idea is that each turn you will activate at least one of your monsters, possibly 2. You may move the Caretos, and the monsters and Caretos have certain things in common. If a Careto moves into an area that has villagers in it, well, the Careto removes the campfire token from the game in case there is one, and then scatters the villagers. You take any one villager there and you place it in a location connected to where you were, and then you place the other villagers in the adjacent locations clockwise until all have left the location, because the Caretos are, I guess, pretty terrifying. If a Careto reaches a location with multiple villagers and scatters them, also the Careto stops moving, even if the game effect allowed the Careto to have more movement points. And the same thing for the monsters controlled by the players. If you enter an area with villagers, again, you scatter them exactly in the same way. The difference is now that you also get to collect the campfire token, which can later be exchanged for different kinds of advantages. And again, a monster entering an area with multiple villagers and scattering them around also stops moving for that turn, unless there are game effects that break that. If a Careto enters an area with a lone villager, the villager is removed from the game. If a monster controlled by a player enters an area with a lone villager, then the owning player captures that villager and the monster can keep moving. Same thing, the Caretos are not stopped by simply capturing They're stopped if they scatter villagers, but they're not stopped when they scatter a monster. They are not stopped, and they don't lose remaining movement points when they capture a lone villager. If a Careto moves in an area with a monster, the monster is removed from the game, placed in the cauldron, and for the time being it stays there. This is not player elimination because you have two monsters and only one monster at a time is in the cauldron. In fact, an easy way to get your monsters out of there is to get a Careto to capture another monster. Then that monster will go in the cauldron and you get the other monster back and you get to bring it back to the board. You can also spend 3 campfire tokens to get your monster out of the cauldron in case your monster is there. So you have a deck of cards, and this is really the heart of the game. The composition of the deck changes depending on the number of players. When you play a card, it may have a symbol on top of the main symbol, a smaller symbol, in which case you resolve that first. If I play this card, the first thing I do is I move a Careto by up to 2 spaces. If I play a card with this symbol, then the scared villagers will congregate, they gather. So if there are lone villagers on the board at that point, when that card with that symbol is played, you need to try to get them into groups so that there are no lone villagers anymore. You can move the lone villagers any number of spaces as long as they enter unoccupied areas. They don't go and meet monsters or Caretos. And if they meet another lone villager, that means they form a new group. Then they also start the fire because they are going to celebrate with some s'mores. If they move and they join a group that already exists, then you don't have a campfire. And so sometimes you want to play with things a little bit so that new campfires are created. So that's for the small symbols that you may find on the activation cards, on the action cards. And then you have the main symbol. When you play a card, you choose one of your monsters and you simply perform the corresponding action. So if I play that card and these are my 2 monsters, I can choose to perform this action with this monster or that action with that monster. They often, almost always, have to do with moving, so you get to move them a number of spaces. Here, move 3 spaces, plus I can move another monster by 3 spaces with that action. Here I can score any group of villagers. Here I can move up to 3 spaces. If the action also features these illustrations, that means that the monster can jump between these locations simply by spending a movement point. So I can move 1, go to an almond, another movement point to jump to another location on the map, and another movement point to move. Other things may happen. Some monsters can move through other monsters, like the Lost Soul can do that. You can move villagers, you can swap your position. It all depends on what your monster does, and they really have impressively different ranges of actions. This action for Maria Gancia only moves Careto, she herself doesn't move, etc, etc. She doesn't move much, but she can jump anywhere she wants. She can also move villagers, etc, etc. So that's the idea. You play your card that may give you effects such as moving the Caretos, creating groups of villagers, and then you move, and again you move. Your movement may result in scattering of villagers and or based on the game effects on the capture of villagers. What else do we have? We have bonus cards. There will be 3 that will be available at the beginning of the game. You can buy a bonus card by spending a campfire token. When you take a bonus card, you place it in your personal play area. A new one is available. And then you can score it later when you meet the conditions on the card. You score them when you scare away villagers, not when you capture them. So, for example, for scaring a group that contains at least 2 yellow meeples, I get to score 2 points. For scaring Away villagers in a location next to the forest, they score 3 points. Scaring villagers in a dolmen area, score 4 points, and so on and so forth. And you can have multiple of those as long as you can acquire them, and also as long as you can get to score them. Each player at the beginning of the game also receives a final bonus card that gives you further ways of scoring. Say here 5 points for each set that contains one of each of the 5 villagers, 2 extra points for each green meeple, 5 points for each set of 3 meeples of the same color, and so on and so forth. You continue like this, moving the Caretos, moving yourselves, scattering them, collecting them into groups, eating them, capturing them, I'm sure, for some very friendly activity, until the game is over, which is over when either all of the villagers have left the board or when you exhaust the deck of cards, whichever comes first. At that point, the game is over and you score victory points. 1 victory point for each villager that you captured. Victory points for the bonus cards that you completed. You reveal your final bonus, you score those points, and at that point, the player with the highest score wins the game. Well, Caretos is a pretty entertaining, pretty enjoyable game. A lot more, I have to tell you, than I imagined from the rule book. I thought it would be a little dry, a little bland, just move around, scatter these people, etc., etc., etc. But actually, it turned out to have a lot more than that. I played it with 2 players and with 3 players. That means with my daughters that are currently 8 and 10. I don't have game night with my adult friends because it's a pandemic, so I'm quarantining. So, by the way, some of you have asked. No, my barber is not on quarantine. I am. And so that means I play games by myself or with my daughters, occasionally with my wife. My daughters really liked the game, and so did I, because we all like the idea of being horrible monsters that roam the countryside and eat people. First, with the added bonus, you terrorize them first, and then you eat them. It just... The building up to that moment where you murder innocent Portuguese villagers just makes it more special. What can I say? And of course, that really works well, with the normal, latent, sadistic instinct of children, because they are monsters themselves, so they can relate with the topic of the game, which really is. The art is pretty cute, but again, the theme is also pretty grim. But you don't have to point out how horrible the theme is. And the game, again, mechanically speaking, is enjoyable because there is more to think than you would imagine at first. Because, well, it's great to have these big packs of villagers, but as you jump in there and do your peekaboo action and they scatter around, you stop moving for that turn. That monster is done moving. So actually, as you prepare the harvest, then you cannot collect it right away, unless you're able to link the symbols, and then you activate both monsters. One of them scares them, and the other one goes and collects them. However, a lot of cards, I don't know if it's done by design, but I had the impression a lot of times that I can pull up that link. It happens with a card that forces me to gather the villagers. So actually, that makes it a lot harder. Other interesting things, of course, I scatter the villagers, but I don't want to do it too close to your monsters, because then you're benefiting from that. I prepare the table and you come and eat all of the delicious villagers. Or I want to do it in a way that doesn't put me too close to the Caretos. So there are just a lot of interesting decisions there that make the game a lot less obvious than I imagined. Almost to the point where it becomes a problem on the other side of the spectrum. That is, the game may result in some analysis paralysis. And not just because I play with kids and they really want to make sure that they covered all options. And there were times I was like, oh, come on, Amelia, just... the 10-year-old, come on, just go. Look at me. I prepare my move in advance. Why can't you do the same? And she does her move, and then it comes to me like, okay, look exactly. Let me show you the advantages of preparing your move in advance. And I realized that her move changed things in a way like, okay, no, wait a second, scratch what I just said. Now I'm pretty embarrassed, but I got to think about this. So it's not just because of the kids, but just due to the fact that the board can change quite a bit between turns. With two players, that of course is less severe. Your mouse is doing something maybe that area and I'm doing something here. But already with three players, you're gonna have times where even though you plan your move in advance, you basically have to plan it again right before your turn. And that means that there is gonna be, or there can be, an element of analysis paralysis that will slow down the game. And sometimes it does happen. I play my move in advance, player before me takes a while, I perform my move exactly as it was, and then I have to wait for a while. So there are moments in which the game can slow down a little bit, but never to the point that it became a deal breaker. I was still excited, I was still interested. Maybe one thing again that I wish was done differently, it feels like those bonus cards, the one that you can buy with the campfire tokens, and to me they had a lot of interest because they can score quite a bit. I've seen cases where victory was decided by those cards, not so much by the villagers. There was a different, 2-3 villagers, and then those cards made the difference. They seem to me a little bit underutilized because to get one of those, you need a campfire. And sometimes just there aren't many campfire tokens because when the gather card appears, maybe the player that has that, instead of forming new groups, they add those lone villagers to existing groups. Why? Precisely because they don't want you to get the campfire tokens. If my monsters are here and the villagers will make a campfire token there, chances are you're gonna use it. So I'm not gonna form that. So there just weren't a lot of campfire tokens, and that aspect of the game so felt a little bit underutilized. But it's not just a weakness, it almost feels like a missed opportunity because it just feels like to me that the game would be even more fun, even more engaging, but also more analyzing, paralyzing. I don't know. But I feel that the game would be more engaging if those bonus cards, the one acquired in the game, had more of a role, but I just struggle to acquire them, and it seems also to me that you rarely see a game where a player gets more than two of them. Two is already not bad. The average seems to be 0 or 1. But again, I play with kids, so maybe that is also different. In general, what you have is a whimsical theme which can be as light and cute or as horrifying and grim as you want it to be, depending on the framework in which you play. It's a game that you can play with young children, but actually I could totally see myself playing this with adult friends during adult game night when that will ever happen again after the pandemic. Again, not all of my friends. I know some are a little more prone to analysis paralysis than others. Then I don't think this is a game that would work with them, but that's a minor thing because in general it is a solid game with very interesting whimsical theme, but also very interesting gameplay because chaining off those actions, using those unique powers, trying to prevent the opponents from using their powers too effectively, ruining a setup that you see other players have created, create your own while preventing other people from ruining it. It's a game that has some really interesting layers of decision here, a lot more than I expected. So it's a game that has chaos and randomness, or in any case, a lot of things happen outside of your control, and yet you do feel that good gameplay is rewarded, and in fact, when you do manage to pull off some interesting combos, it's particularly rewarding. So, Caretos, pretty interesting game, fun theme, and a solid, engaging gameplay.